Justice for these killers will be certain, swift, and severe. We will find them, we will convict them, and we will seek the death penalty for them.
It was promised to the people of Oklahoma City and to the rest of America that every single person responsible for the bombing would be caught, tried, and held accountable for the harm they had inflicted. It was expected that this promise would be fulfilled. Nevertheless, as eyewitness testimony and other promising leads were being carelessly discarded, replaced only with the lies and inconsistencies of federal officials, a deep but private suspicion grew in the minds of observers that perhaps a government cover-up was underway. Was this mere incompetence, or was there something else at work here?
I was a police officer in the Tulsa Police Department for 27 years. And in 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, I was requested by the local FBI office through our chief of police to assist any way I could and look into the bombing, and using my contacts as an investigative journalist, which is what I did on the side, to try to find out anything we could find out about the bombing, McVeigh, Nichols, and just kind of follow the investigation any place it went, just follow the leads. I was still working the case with Jana Davis and David Hoffman, two Oklahoma City police officers, and one of them, it was one of the first ones in the building, and he saw some things in the building. He saw the biggest damage to the building was the pit, which was in the back of the building and went down like 2 or 3 floors. He saw all of that, you know. That never came out in the news. It wasn't part of the investigation. It didn't count. In other words, if it didn't fit the mold that the Department of Justice under Janet Reno set for the FBI, then it wasn't put in the case, period.
The FBI bragged about its handling of the deadliest terror attack in American history, but gigantic holes in the case were being ignored by the media. McVeigh was first suspected because he rented the truck under the name Robert Kling. One of the first pieces of evidence used to link McVeigh to the bombing was problematic.
I went to Junction City. I went out to Elliott's body shop, and I spoke to Mr. Elliott. I told him who I was, and I said, I would like for you to tell me what happened the day Tim came to rent the Ryder truck. And he said, you mean the day Tim and his friend came? And I said, Tim wasn't by himself? He said, no, ma'am.
The FBI has been designated by President Clinton as the lead federal agency in this investigation.
Incredibly enough, there remains an extra unidentified leg that was found in the rubble. Oklahoma State Medical Examiner Fred Jordan testified in court, "We had 8 people with traumatically amputated left legs. However, we have 9 left legs. We have 1 leg too many." Stephen Jones, McVeigh's defense attorney, detailed in his book, Others Unknown, the significance of this extra leg. Former chief pathologist for Northern Ireland, T.K. Marshall, performed over 2,500 autopsies on bombing victims and told Jones that, in all the years in Ireland, we identified every innocent person that was killed. There was never an unknown victim. The FBI collected 1,034 fingerprints during their investigation, but an agent admitted under oath that these prints were not run through the National Fingerprint Database. Nikki Deutschman was the jury foreperson for the federal trial of Terry Nichols.
I think that the government perhaps really dropped the ball. I think that there were a large number of sightings right around before the week before and the days and months after the bombing, and sketches of people that were recognizable. In this trial, there even was a photograph of someone who may have been involved with mixing the bomb, with putting the bomb together. And that person, it was a photograph from a newspaper. Obviously, that person's identity is known. I think there are other people out there, and decisions were probably made very early on that Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols were who they were looking for, and the same sort of resources were not used to try to find out who else might be involved.
Well, in those first couple of days, especially that first day of the Oklahoma City bombing, there was immediate information that came out about what caused the bombing, witnesses on the scene of the crime, things such as that. And it changed very significantly and drastically as the day went by and the next several days went by. That caused a lot of questions in people's minds about, well, what really happened here?
The reason I started doubting the official story that was coming out, you have to understand that the local media were doing a good job the first day. Local law enforcement maybe also, I believe, was doing a good job. But once the feds came in, things started changing.
The police and emergency crews are talking about moving us back because of the danger of a possibility of another explosion.
I think he said another bomb.
Another bomb, move back. Oh my God, another bomb.
The fire crews and the various emergency crews are trying to get in, but we keep getting reports that there may be other devices in the area.
They will use that trailer. You see the bucket on the back there, sort of, this is how they would transport the explosive device away from this populated area to try to do something with it.
There were two unexploded devices discovered subsequent to the initial explosion.
A second bomb was found on the east side of that building. A bomb squad is on the scene. That second bomb has not exploded. We don't know quite the status yet, if they've managed to defuse it, but it has been confirmed.
There have been reports of two explosive devices, unexploded explosive devices.
Two different explosive devices were found in addition to the one that went off.
Just an hour after the initial explosion, downtown Oklahoma City was shaken up again with word of another bomb, or maybe two.
They've had to back off a couple times because they found, I guess, 2 or 3 other bombs, or at least explosive devices down there that they've had to defuse.
They shut down our operation for about 20, 30 minutes because of that, and that was very frustrating because we were right at the point where we had people and we had to leave them.
The first bomb that was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there. The second explosive was found and diffused.
The Oklahoma City bombing was one of the first big stories that I covered, and it was just shocking to know it was an inside job and to know that the media was involved in the cover-up and that the mainstream television stations there in Oklahoma City knew what had really happened. And then years later, I was able to actually talk to some of those reporters, and they discussed how they were told to shut up. I mean, it just showed how people were so willing to be part of the cover-up just because the truth was so frightening. And that's really why we become so enslaved, is that we just give in to the lies, and they start little, but they get bigger and bigger.
It's amazing when everyone who can see an event, and that gets changed into something else, simply because the media presents it that way. That means the media is complicit in the cover-up. They're not hapless. They're not ignorant. How come I can figure this out and CNN can't?
The controlled corporate mainstream media is essential to a cover-up like Oklahoma City being successful. And that's why the mainstream media has lost so much credibility. Because all over the nation, people have seen things like Oklahoma City over and over again, where you see the live footage, you see them removing the bombs, you see the governor admitting it. And then later the media says, we never said that. That's what conspiracy theorists say.
At first, the media reported on some of these bothersome pieces of evidence, but they became little more than parrots for the Justice Department as the official story was railroaded into the public mind.
Been listening to Mike McCurry, President Clinton's spokesperson at the White House. Apparently at this point we know a little bit more than the White House does, because we have been able to confirm that it was a car explosion. That word coming to us from Mayor Ron Norick earlier, 1,200 pounds of explosives parked out in front of the federal building. And ATF has confirmed that as well.
Who's going to investigate the investigators? Who's going to investigate the prosecutors? Who's going to hold them accountable? Who's going to hold us public officials accountable? And that's all we're trying to do here, in addition to trying to find the truth.
Well, initially that morning, all the media that was downtown there were reporting the truth. They reported the truth about the unexploded bombs, undetonated bombs being removed from the building. By afternoon, things began to ease a little bit. You could sense a difference, and by the next day, everybody but Channel 4 had changed their story completely.
One local station in Oklahoma City, KFOR-TV, did perform its duty by reporting on McVeigh's accomplices, the evidence of prior warnings, and many other aspects of the case. The New York Times Broadcasting Company purchased KFOR a year after the bombing. The programming director was fired, the lead journalist on the bombing, Jana Davis, was let go, and all reporting that contradicted the government vanished. The victims turned to the government with their questions, expecting the full truth to come out. This was not to be. Those who asked too many questions or knew too much were discouraged from their efforts in other ways.
Debbie Nakanashi, who was with the post office, she was told not to talk to anybody about that. Her job had been threatened to her. She went to the union over it. Then they apologized. But she and I went on a number of occasions to Washington, D.C. We tried to see every senator and every congressman from Oklahoma. Not one would give us an interview.
I was told by an agent, an FBI agent, that due to comments that I'd made, that people like me often ended up dead, and you'd be careful what I said if I was him. And in the way that he put it forth, I felt like it was a threat.
I wrote letters to Janet Reno when she was the United States Attorney General. I wrote Louis Freeh, who was over the FBI at that time. I wrote Senator Orrin Hatch. I wrote everybody I could think of asking for help. Nothing was done.
When the government decided that the investigation was over, a federal grand jury was impaneled to hand down indictments. This is usually a straightforward process. But the federal prosecutors were not counting on one grand juror, Hoppy Heidelberg, to actually ask questions of his own.
My name is Hoppy Heidelberg, and I served on the federal grand jury that was supposed to investigate the Murrah Building bombing in Oklahoma City back in 1995. Actually, the grand jury has two responsibilities that are outlined in this book. The first one is says the grand jury operates as a sword authorizing the government's prosecution of suspected criminals, and also as a shield protecting citizens from unwarranted or inappropriate prosecutions. Now, that's not something that the media or the government ever points out, but that was actually the reason for a grand jury in the first place, to protect citizens from the Crown, who at the time had a habit of prosecuting their political enemies or anybody they chose for any reason. The grand jury, our grand jury, that was supposed to be calling witnesses, were not allowed to call any. And it was my letter to the judge telling him that and demanding that we be allowed to call witnesses that got me excused from the grand jury. What you will hear and what they say that's a lie is that the grand jury foreman is the only one that has the right to do this or that. And that's not true. According to the book, any member can demand anything he wants for any reason. It can be just his personal opinion. It can be from information he gets. And of course, they tell us, well, you can't watch TV, or you can't read the paper. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. Grand jurors need to be well informed if they're going to do their job properly. See, we were never allowed to see the photo evidence from the cameras on the Murrah building that would have shown the truck being parked and the people who got out of the truck. That's all on tape. And we were authorized to see all of that, but we weren't allowed to see it. And in fact, nobody's been allowed to see it. All those tapes have been kept under wraps for 15 years. It was just too important to the American people to know what happened there for me to keep quiet, because nobody else was going to speak up. The other grand jurors were petrified because they observed on a daily basis the kind of intimidation tactics that were used by the Department of Justice attorneys to attempt to keep me under control. And when they found out about the FBI visits to my home, I really shook them up. Now they're even scared to talk to me in the men's room.
Hoppy will never be silenced. In 1998, he ran as an independent candidate for governor of Oklahoma, intent on reopening the investigation into the bombing. After being excluded from the gubernatorial debate, Hoppy walked on stage to ask Governor Frank Keating why.
Y'all both are on record as saying that you think I should participate. Do you still believe that?
Thank you, audience. Mr. Jenkins, your follow-up now.
Two years after the bombing, the trial of Tim McVeigh began in Denver, Colorado. The trial had been moved out of Oklahoma despite the constitutional mandate that federal crimes must be tried in the district in which they occurred. The truth seekers were assured that all of their questions would be answered in court.
The trial was not handled appropriately. It was handled in a way that was very prejudiced against the defendants. If you look at what Judge Maitch did concerning prejudicing the jury toward the people that were being prosecuted, by 2 weeks he showed them pictures of dead babies and blood and guts, and which is all basically, in my understanding of the law, illegal to prejudice the jury like that. Yet they did that kind of stuff apparently on purpose.
I was told that by the U.S. attorney that if I attended the trials in Denver, that all of my questions would be answered. I gave up everything I had, my apartment and everything, and I moved to Denver. And I attended both trials, and by the time Terry Nichols' trial was over, I had more questions and no answers.
The trial lasted 3 weeks. In contrast, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995 had lasted 9 months. The jury deliberated for less than 24 hours and sentenced Tim McVeigh to death. McVeigh waived all his appeals and was fast-tracked to be the first federal prisoner executed in decades. Just before his execution date, the FBI announced that they had withheld thousands of pages of documents that could have influenced his trial, which led to a month-long stay of execution.
I mean, they weren't able to get thousands, at least thousands, probably a lot more than that, of documents from, the FBI and the DOJ. They just wouldn't turn them over.
On June 11, 2001, Tim McVeigh was put to death by lethal injection at the federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana. He left no message and was quickly cremated without an autopsy being performed on his body, contrary to the standard procedure for executed prisoners. Terry Nichols was tried and found guilty in a separate trial and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In 2004, Terry Nichols was then tried in Oklahoma on state murder charges in the prosecutor's hope of imposing a death sentence. Nichols was found guilty, but a jury once again refused to execute him.
Those jurors did the best job they could with the case that was presented to them. I think what their statement says is they knew there was something wrong and somebody had some involvement here. They also, as they have said themselves, that there were lies, there were mistruths, there were bungling, there was arrogance, there was things that were not pursued like the other John Does, and so they felt like there was a reasonable doubt.
Michael Fortier became a witness for the federal prosecutors, received a 10-year sentence, and was released in 2006 directly into the Witness Protection Program. Justice, the government announced, had been served.
And I know tomorrow will be the same, 'cause we got a life of love that won't ever change.
Hey, my dad's good. Don't listen.
As the government proclaimed justice for all impacted by the bombing, the people back in Oklahoma still sought the truth and knew now they were on their own. The list of questions continued to grow due to the mysterious death of Oklahoma City police officer Sergeant Terrence Yakey. Terry Yakey, unlike the rest of Oklahoma, may have known too much. Officer Yakey was just over 30 years old at the time of the bombing. The morning of the bombing, he was issuing a traffic ticket near the Civic Center Music Hall, which is about 4 blocks to the west of where the Murray Building stood. He dropped the ticket book, let the woman go, and says, I have to obviously attend to other things. He heard the multiple blasts coming from the Murray Building. sped up there in his black and white squad car and immediately started pulling out the first of 8 people, Mr. Tom Hall being the first, a former employee of the GSA. Tom, to this day, in fact, I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, still has the utmost respect for Officer Yaki. He literally saved his life. Officer Yaki, being an astute police officer for 7 years, veteran of the Oklahoma City Police Department, knew that something was horribly wrong. He tried to get the official storyline out through his commanding officers at the Oklahoma City Police Department, through his family, through his ex-wife, and he chose to withhold some of the storyline because he was in fear for his family and his wife and his 2 young daughters at the time. What we found out, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. that morning, he was brutally murdered 1.5 miles from the front gate of the El Reno Penitentiary. From that moment that his body was found, we know that the crime scene was destroyed. There were spade shovels that were used to turn over the crime scene. Ballistics, any gunpowder residue, anything that had to do with his death was completely destroyed. It was corrupted.
He started having problems with it, not only at work, but his apartment got broke into, his car got broke into, things were stolen out of his house. He had accumulated reports, evidence, I don't know what all, but he was going to take it out to a mini storage in El Reno. And he left one night, and he told a friend of his that they were going to go out to dinner. He says, I got to run out and put some stuff in mini storage, and as soon as I shake these feds that are following me, I'll be back and we'll go to dinner. Well, he never came back. Instead, he was found the next day by a Canadian County Sheriff's deputy. Well, they found his car first, and then they found him in a field near the El Reno Penitentiary. The damage to his body was obviously a torture homicide. It was obvious. But what intrigued me the most, that he had several cuts on both of his wrists, inside both elbows, both jugular veins. He'd been beaten. He had ligature marks around his neck. He had handcuff marks on his hands, on his wrists. And he had a small caliber bullet wound that started above on the right-hand side of his temple and exited low on his cheek with no powder burns.
The day of his death, when my daughter called me, I left work, went to El Reno to help because I could hear the seriousness in her voice, that she was getting upset. Why would the police be calling her looking for Terrence? And when we went to the apartment where he lived, the manager there stated to us, well, why are you looking for him? The police have already been here and taken his cruiser. So I'm not sure what was going on. It was strange. And about 10 o'clock at night, I had put my grandkids to bed. The phone rang, and when I picked the phone up, I could hear my daughter screaming in the background. And I assumed something bad had happened, but I didn't think death. And my son said, Mom, they found Terry. He's dead.
One of the things that surprised me was that there was no autopsy performed. The other thing that really bothered me was we were being told that Terry was high on drugs and drunk. And, of course, the medical examiner's office did a report on Terry and his injuries, which was really not an autopsy, but just an overview. And it showed that his BAC was 0, meaning no blood alcohol content. There was no drugs in his system. It bothered me that they didn't treat Terry like a police officer like he was. He was a good guy.
And he never said to us that I'm depressed. I'm, you know, I need help. Not to me, or not to his sisters. I think it's only fair that we know, as Terrence's family members, what happened.
Officer Yaki's official cause of death was suicide. And that was actually laid out in the medical examiner's report at the Oklahoma State Medical Office, Examiner's Office. We've since were able to retrieve that record. What we found out, though, is that, number one, the crime scene was corrupted, went completely in the face of a proper investigative procedure. The extent and the amount of, and the number of wounds on his body clearly shows that he couldn't commit suicide. Physically and logistically, you just can't do that to yourself. Terry also, we knew, was anemic. He would not have been able to traverse over half a mile from where his car was to where his body was found and not have passed out. His heart would have literally given out. He wouldn't have had enough blood pressure in his body to survive. The car was locked. The windows were rolled up. The keys were in the console. There was a bloody knife in the glove box. You don't stab yourself 13 times and have superficial wounds on the, along your arms and chest and your upper neck, and walk a half a mile and decide to die next to a tree.
Being the family of an officer, I expected some kind of care and consideration for us, being the family of Terrence. There was another detective by the name of Mullinex that told my daughter that she looked at too many movies and she needed to see a psychiatrist. When we were asking questions, wanting to know about his belongings, wanting to know about things that happened during the course of where they say they found my son. And I don't think this was very kind of them and considerate of us being family, that they should have talked to us like that. But they did. And as far as I'm concerned, that made me more suspicious of what happened to my son.
The brutal torture and murder of Terry Yeagy served not only to silence his voice, but the voices of other first responders who may have seen something that would shed light on what really happened. Those who keep their silence know exactly what Terry saw, but he will never be forgotten by those who ask questions and demand answers. In the absence of official action, a group of concerned citizens decided to form their own investigative panel, the O.K.C, better known as the Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee. Their goal was to compile enough evidence that would attract attention by the media and the government, and therefore compel a more thorough investigation. Entirely funded by donations and their own money, the O.K.C took affidavits, recorded eyewitness testimony, and paid for private investigators to chase down leads.
I'm Charles Key, State Representative in Oklahoma City, and I formed the Oklahoma Bombing Investigation Committee. I had a number of constituents come to me and other people that started raising their own questions about the investigation, what direction it was going, because it seemed like there was an effort to try to change that initial report of what took place on the first day of the bombing as the days and weeks went by.
We look at what State Representative
Justice for these killers will be certain, swift, and severe. We will find them, we will convict them, and we will seek the death penalty for them.
It was promised to the people of Oklahoma City and to the rest of America that every single person responsible for the bombing would be caught, tried, and held accountable for the harm they had inflicted. It was expected that this promise would be fulfilled. Nevertheless, as eyewitness testimony,
I said, I would like for you to tell me what happened the day Tim came to rent the Ryder truck. And he said, you mean the day Tim and his friend came? And I said, Tim wasn't by himself? He said, no, ma'am.
The FBI has been designated by President Clinton as the lead federal agency in this investigation.
Incredibly enough, there remains an extra unidentified leg that was found in the rubble. Oklahoma State Medical Examiner
bombing, and using my contacts as an investigative journalist, which is what I did on the side, to try to find out anything we could find out about the bombing, McVeigh, Nichols, and just kind of follow the investigation any place it went, just follow the leads. I was still working the case with Janie Davis and David Hoffman, two Oklahoma City police officers, and one of them, it was one of the first ones in the building. And he saw some things in the building. He saw the biggest damage to the building was the pit, which was in the back of the building and went down like 2 or 3 floors. He saw all of that, you know. That never came out in the news. It wasn't part of the investigation. It just...
And other promising leads were being carelessly discarded, replaced only with the lies and inconsistencies of federal officials. A deep but private suspicion grew in the minds of observers that perhaps a government cover-up was underway. Was this mere incompetence, or was there something else at work here?
I was a police officer in the Tulsa Police Department for 27 years. And in 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, I was requested by the local FBI office through our chief of police to assist any way I could and look into it. It didn't count. In other words, if it didn't fit the mold that the Department of Justice under Janet Reno set for the FBI, then it wasn't put in the case, period.
The FBI bragged about its handling of the deadliest terror attack in American history, but gigantic holes in the case were being ignored by the media. McVeigh was first suspected because he rented the truck under the name Robert Kling. One of the first pieces of evidence used to link McVeigh to the bombing was problematic.
I went to Junction City. I went out to Elliott's body shop, and I spoke to Mr. Elliott. I told him who I was, and